What's the most shocking thing you found in your parents' safe when they thought you'd never open it? I'm Max. I'm 15. And I've spent my whole life wondering why my parents treat me like a house guest they're too polite to ask to leave. They do all the technical parent stuff. Food appears in the fridge. I get driven places. Report cards get signed. But there's no warmth, no pride when I win science fairs, no concern when I'm sick. Just this cold efficiency like they're following a manual. When I was 10, I went to my friend's house and watched his mom cry with joy because he made the soccer team. My mom didn't even look up from her laptop when I won the state robotics championship. Last Monday, I found out why. They'd gone to their monthly date night, really just an excuse to leave me alone. I was looking for my birth certificate for a school trip form when I found their safe behind fake books. The combination was my birthday. Ironic. Inside were the usual documents. Then I found a folder labeled M Contract. It was a surrogacy agreement from 16 years ago. My parents had paid a woman named Claire $75,000 to carry me. Standard stuff until I got to the addendums. Addendum 7. In the event of divorce before the child's 18th birthday, the party initiating separation forfeits all marital assets. Addendum 9. Should anything happen to the child before age 18, both parties inherit equal shares of the Whitmore Trust, $8 million. My hands went numb. The Whitmore Trust was my mom's father's money, left specifically for his first grandchild, me. But if I died before 18, it went to my parents instead. I kept reading, found email printouts between them from last year. Mom, 2 more years. We can make it 2 more years. Dad, unless there's an accident. Teenage boys are so reckless. Mom, don't even joke about that. We agreed to wait. I threw up in the office trash can. More emails. They'd been researching boarding schools in Switzerland, places where skiing accidents happen, where mountain climbing is mandatory, where safety standards are more relaxed. They were planning to send me somewhere I might conveniently die. I photocopied everything with shaking hands, put it all back exactly as I found it. Spent the next week pretending everything was normal while they discussed my amazing opportunity at Alpine Academy. You'll love Switzerland, Mom said over dinner. So many adventure activities. Rock climbing without those annoying safety regulations, Dad added. Really builds character. I smiled and agreed, started packing enthusiastically. Let them think I was excited. The night before my flight, I walked into the living room with printed documents. I'm not going to Switzerland. They looked up from their wine. Max, don't be difficult. I dropped the surrogacy contract on the table. I know about the trust. I know about the accident clause. Mom's wine glass shattered on the floor. I also know about Claire. Dad stood up. You don't understand. I understand you've been planning my death for profit. I pulled out my phone. I've already sent everything to Grandpa Whitmore's lawyer. Mom lunged for my phone. You little! The doorbell rang. That'll be Claire, I said. My biological mother. The one you've been hiding from. The one who's been trying to find me for 15 years. I opened the door. A woman who looked exactly like me stood there with a lawyer and 2 police officers. Hello, Max, she said, tears streaming. I've been fighting to get you back since the day they stole you. Stole? I turned to my parents. The lawyer stepped forward. The surrogacy was illegal. They forged Claire's signature on the adoption papers. She never agreed to give you up permanently. But that wasn't even the biggest revelation. What Claire said next changed everything. Max, you have a twin sister. They only took you because the trust specified a male heir. Claire stepped into the house, and I saw my own eyes staring back at me from her face, the same green with those little gold flecks near the center that I always thought made me look weird. The 2 police officers moved fast, positioning themselves between my adoptive parents and the door like they expected someone to run. A man in a gray suit followed Claire inside, carrying a leather briefcase that looked expensive and official. He introduced himself as Theodore Tate, Claire's attorney, and his voice had this calm authority that made everything feel suddenly real in a way it hadn't been before. He explained that they had a court order for emergency custody based on the evidence I sent to Grandpa Whitmore's lawyer, and he pulled out papers from his briefcase to prove it. Mom's face went from shocked to furious in about 2 seconds. She lunged toward me, screaming that I'd ruined everything, that I was an ungrateful little brat who didn't understand what they'd sacrificed. One of the officers blocked her path before she got close, and Dad grabbed her arm, trying to pull her back. The officer asked me if I felt safe, and I shook my head because I didn't. Not anymore. Not after reading those emails about skiing accidents and relaxed safety standards. They escorted my adoptive parents to separate rooms, Mom still yelling about how I'd destroyed the family, Dad silent and pale like he might throw up. Claire stood in the hallway crying and reaching toward me but not touching me, like she was afraid I might disappear if she got too close. Theodore Tate started explaining everything in this methodical way that made it sound like a legal case instead of my entire life falling apart. He told me that Grandpa Whitmore's lawyer, some guy named Jasper Blackwell, contacted the police immediately after receiving my evidence. They'd been building a case for the past week while monitoring the house, which explained why nobody had shown up earlier when I first sent everything. A woman stepped forward from behind the officers, shorter than Claire with dark hair pulled back tight. She introduced herself as Alice Huang, detective with the Family Crimes Unit. She told me they had enough evidence to arrest my adoptive parents for kidnapping, fraud, and conspiracy. The words sounded fake, like something from a TV show, not something that applied to the people who'd been signing my report cards for 15 years. Detective Huang explained that the surrogacy contract was completely illegal, that Claire never agreed to give me up permanently, and that my adoptive parents had forged signatures on adoption papers that should never have existed. I kept waiting to feel something big, some huge emotion, but mostly I just felt numb and tired. Claire finally spoke directly to me, her voice shaking so bad I could barely understand her at first. She told me she never stopped looking and never gave up hope. She explained that she thought I died in the hospital because that's what my adoptive parents told everyone, showed them fake death certificates and everything. She only discovered the truth 6 months ago, when a private investigator found adoption records that shouldn't exist, buried in some database that wasn't properly sealed. She'd been working with Theodore and the police ever since, building a case, waiting for the right moment. I asked why she waited, why she didn't just show up earlier, and she said they needed solid evidence, or my adoptive parents could have claimed she was harassing them and gotten a restraining order. The whole time she talked, tears kept streaming down her face, but she didn't wipe them away, just let them fall. I noticed she had the same habit I do of twisting her hands together when she's nervous, fingers lacing and unlacing over and over. Detective Huang asked if I wanted to press charges, and the question felt too big for my brain to process. I looked at Claire, who told me it was completely my decision and she'd support whatever I chose. I thought about 15 years of cold indifference, of watching other kids' parents hug them after soccer games while mine checked their phones. I thought about those emails planning my death, discussing boarding schools with dangerous activities like they were shopping for a car. I thought about the Whitmore Trust and how I was only worth keeping alive until they could figure out a way to make my death look accidental. I told Detective Huang yes, I wanted them prosecuted for everything they did. Mom heard me from the other room and started screaming again, calling me a traitor and worse things the officers told her to stop saying. Dad just sat silent in the kitchen, staring at the table like he could find answers in the wood grain. My adoptive parents were arrested that night, handcuffed and read their rights while I watched from the living room with Claire's hand finally resting on my shoulder. The touch felt foreign but not bad, warm and solid in a way I wasn't used to. The officers led them out separately, Mom still yelling about lawyers and lawsuits, Dad stumbling like he couldn't quite figure out how to walk. The house suddenly felt empty and huge, all this space that had never actually been filled with anything real. I realized I'd never actually felt at home here because it never was my home, just a place where I existed while two people waited for me to either turn 18 or die. The silence after they left was so complete I could hear the refrigerator humming in the kitchen, the clock ticking in the hallway, sounds I'd never noticed before. Claire showed me photos on her phone of a girl who looked exactly like me, but with longer hair and the same crooked smile I see in the mirror every morning. She told me about Priscilla, explained that Priscilla has been waiting at Claire's apartment because she didn't want to overwhelm me, but she's desperate to meet me. I stared at the photos, at this person who was apparently my twin sister, who'd been living her whole life knowing her brother was stolen. Claire scrolled through dozens of pictures, Priscilla at different ages, doing normal things like birthday parties and school plays and science fairs. In every single photo, there was an empty space next to her, like she was saving room for someone who wasn't there. Claire explained that they always set 2 places at dinner, always bought 2 birthday cakes, always kept my half of the room ready, even though I wasn't there to use it. The idea of someone spending 15 years waiting for me felt impossible to understand. A social worker arrived maybe an hour later, a tired-looking woman with a clipboard who asked me dozens of questions about where I wanted to stay tonight. She wanted to know if I felt safe with Claire, if I understood what was happening, if I needed time to process before making decisions. I looked at Claire, this stranger who's my actual mother, who'd been searching for me since the day I was stolen. Something in my chest told me she was safe, told me that someone who'd spent 15 years looking couldn't be dangerous. I said I wanted to go with her. The social worker made notes and asked more questions, but eventually she agreed to temporary emergency placement pending a full custody hearing. Theodore Tate assured her that the custody case was solid, that there was zero chance my adoptive parents would get me back, given the criminal charges. The social worker told me I could pack a bag with whatever I needed, and I realized I didn't actually know what I needed because I'd never had to think about it before. We drove to Claire's apartment in awkward silence, the kind where you know you should say something, but have no idea what words would even make sense. After about 10 minutes, Claire started talking about random things like her favorite foods and the fact that she's a nurse at the children's hospital. She told me she's been working extra shifts for years to pay the private investigator who finally found me, saving every spare dollar for the search. She never dated or remarried because all her energy went into looking for me, into following every lead no matter how small. She talked about Priscilla's robotics projects, about how Priscilla always insisted I was alive somewhere, how she refused to let Claire give up hope even when the trail went cold. I learned that Claire lives in a small 2-bedroom apartment across town, that she drives a beat-up Honda that's older than me, that she eats cereal for dinner sometimes because she's too tired to cook after double shifts. Everything she said painted this picture of a life that had been on hold for 15 years, waiting for this moment. Priscilla was waiting by the window when we pulled up, and I could see her face pressed against the glass even from the parking lot. She flew out the apartment door before we even finished parking, and suddenly I was hugged by someone who feels like looking in a mirror. Same height, same build, same everything, except she smells like vanilla, and her hair is way longer than mine. She talked a mile a minute about how she always knew I existed, how she felt incomplete her whole life like she was missing a piece of herself. She said Mom never let her forget that her brother was stolen, that they'd been fighting to get me back since the day I was taken. She pulled back to look at my face, touching my cheek like she needed to make sure I was real, and I saw tears running down her face that matched the ones on mine. She kept saying my name over and over, like she needed to confirm I existed outside her imagination. Inside the apartment, I stopped moving when I saw the wall. One entire wall from floor to ceiling covered in me. Photos I never knew existed, newspaper clippings from robotics competitions, science fair ribbons pinned next to blurry pictures taken from the back of auditoriums. Claire must have attended every single event, hidden in crowds, documenting a son she couldn't claim. Report cards appeared there too, copies she'd somehow gotten from the school offices or bribed someone to provide. Between the photos were drawings, dozens of them, all signed by Priscilla in different handwriting styles that showed her aging through the years. Stick figures holding hands evolved into detailed sketches of 2 teenagers standing side by side. In every drawing, she'd left space for the brother she'd never met, drawing herself next to an empty outline that waited to be filled. I touched one of the photos, my 12-year-old self holding a trophy, and saw the crease marks from being folded and unfolded countless times. Another showed me walking out of school, taken from across the street with a telephoto lens. She'd been watching my whole life, collecting pieces of me like evidence that I still existed somewhere in the world. Priscilla showed me the second bedroom, smaller than a closet really, with 2 twin beds crammed against opposite walls. One side looked lived in with posters and books and clothes scattered around. The other side sat pristine and waiting, made up with fresh sheets and a stuffed robot on the pillow that looked handmade. She told me she'd sewn it 3 years ago in home economics class, making it for the brother she hoped would come home someday. I sat on the edge of the bed that had been mine without me knowing it existed, and Priscilla sat on hers, and we just looked at each other for a while. Claire appeared in the doorway with blankets and pillows, explaining apologetically that I'd have to sleep on the couch tonight because she needed to wash the sheets on the spare bed first, even though they looked perfectly clean to me. I understood she needed to do something, needed to feel like she was taking care of me in some tangible way. That first night felt impossible. I lay on the couch in the dark living room, surrounded by photos of myself on the wall, and couldn't process that this was real. Every time I started to drift off, I'd open my eyes and find Claire sitting in the chair across from me, just watching. Not in a creepy way, but like she was afraid if she looked away, I'd disappear again. The first time I caught her, she whispered an apology and stood to leave, but I told her it was okay. She could stay. The second time, around 2 in the morning, she was crying silently, and I pretended to stay asleep because I didn't know what to say. The third time, just before dawn, I opened my eyes and asked if she'd been awake all night. She admitted she couldn't sleep, couldn't stop looking at me, couldn't believe I was actually here. I told her I wasn't going anywhere, and she started crying again, harder this time. Morning came with the smell of something burning. I found Priscilla in the tiny kitchen, frantically waving a towel at the smoke detector while a pan of blackened pancakes smoked on the stove. She was laughing and crying at the same time, explaining that she'd been planning to make me breakfast for 15 years, and now she'd ruined it because her hands wouldn't stop shaking. Claire appeared and took over, scraping the burnt pancakes into the trash while Priscilla started a new batch. This time I helped, mixing the batter while Priscilla poured and Claire set the table. We worked together in the cramped space, bumping into each other, and it felt completely different from the cold efficiency of my old house. When we finally sat down to eat slightly less burnt pancakes, Priscilla kept asking if I wanted more syrup, more juice, more anything, like she'd been saving up 15 years of wanting to take care of someone. Claire watched us both with this expression I'd never seen before on anyone's face when looking at me. Pride mixed with joy, mixed with relief, mixed with love. I'd won dozens of awards and never seen anyone look at me like that. Now someone was looking at me that way just for existing, just for sitting at their table eating burnt pancakes. The phone rang around 10, and Claire answered, her expression shifting to serious as she listened. She handed me the phone, mouthing Theodore's name. The lawyer's voice came through crisp and professional, explaining legal processes I barely understood. Custody hearings that would happen within weeks because my adoptive parents were in jail and couldn't fight emergency placement. Criminal trials that would take months to work through the system. Something about the Whitmore Trust and how Grandpa was involved now. Theodore said Grandpa wanted to meet me immediately, that he was furious his daughter and son-in-law had committed fraud, using his trust as motivation. The whole conversation felt surreal, discussing my life like it was a legal case instead of 15 years of loneliness and lies. Theodore asked if I had questions, and I asked when I'd have to see my adoptive parents again. He promised not until the trial, and only if I chose to attend. I could give testimony by video if I wanted. The choice was mine. That phrase kept appearing in conversations now. The choice was mine. Like I'd never had choices before, and everyone wanted to make sure I knew I had them now. 2 days later, Claire drove me downtown to a law office in a building that smelled like old carpet and air conditioning. Jasper Blackwell's name appeared on a door in gold letters, and inside sat an old man behind a massive desk covered in legal documents. Grandpa looked me over when I walked in, his eyes moving from my face to my hands to my shoes, like he was judging the quality of merchandise. His expression stayed hard and unreadable, and I started to think maybe he blamed me somehow for his daughter's choices. Then his face changed completely. It crumbled like a wall collapsing, and suddenly he looked old and tired and sad. He told me he was sorry, his voice breaking on the words. Sorry he'd created a trust that motivated kidnapping. Sorry he'd specified a male heir without thinking about what that might cause. Sorry he hadn't known his own daughter was capable of stealing a child. He promised he was changing the trust immediately to include both me and Priscilla equally, that gender shouldn't have mattered in the first place. I didn't know what to say to this old man apologizing for things that weren't really his fault, so I just nodded. He stood and hugged me awkwardly, and I felt him shaking. The custody hearing happened so fast, I barely had time to process it. 1 week after leaving my old house, I sat in a courtroom while a judge reviewed documents and asked Claire questions about her home and income and ability to care for a teenage boy. My adoptive parents didn't appear because they were in jail awaiting trial, and their lawyer didn't even bother arguing against emergency custody. The evidence was too clear, the crimes too obvious. The judge granted Claire full emergency custody pending permanent adoption proceedings, and just like that, I legally became her son again. Priscilla squeezed my hand so hard during the ruling that I lost feeling in my fingers, and I squeezed back just as hard. We sat in the courtroom crying while the judge signed papers that gave me back to the mother who'd never stopped fighting to find me. Claire hugged us both, whispering thank you over and over like we'd given her something instead of the other way around. Going back to my old house to get my stuff felt like visiting a crime scene. Claire and Priscilla came with me, and we walked through rooms that had never felt like home and now felt actively hostile. I looked at my bedroom, at all the expensive things my adoptive parents had bought to fulfill their obligation to care for the heir to the trust. Top-of-the-line computer, professional robotics equipment, designer clothes I'd never asked for. None of it felt like mine. It all felt like props in a performance where I played the role of beloved son while they counted down days until the trust unlocked, or I conveniently died. I took my robotics projects, the ones I'd built myself, and my regular clothes that I actually liked. Everything else could stay. Priscilla found a photo album in my closet and opened it to pictures of me as a baby. She showed me one photo of an infant being held by Claire in a hospital bed, and I realized this was the only proof I had of my first day alive. Claire took the photo with shaking hands and pressed it against her chest. We packed fast and left, and I didn't look back at the house when we drove away. Claire's apartment became my real home over the next few weeks, and I discovered things about myself I never knew existed. Priscilla showed me her room one afternoon, and I stopped in the doorway because everything was organized by color, just like I'd been doing in my old bedroom without realizing it was weird. Her books went from red to orange to yellow to green. Her art supplies lined up in rainbow order, and she laughed when she saw my face. She asked if I did the same thing, and I nodded, pulling out my phone to show her photos of my robotics parts, sorted by color in plastic bins. We spent the next hour comparing our organizational systems and found we both labeled everything with the same handwriting style, both used the same method for tracking projects, and both got annoyed when things weren't symmetrical. She pulled out a half-built robot from under her bed, and I recognized the design immediately because I'd built something almost identical 3 months ago. We laid both projects side by side on her floor and realized we'd used different approaches to solve the same engineering problem, and somehow that felt more profound than sharing a face. Claire worked the night shift at the hospital 3 times a week, and those nights Priscilla and I stayed up way too late talking in the living room where my futon was set up. She told me about being 5 years old and knowing something was missing, how she used to draw 2 stick figures in every picture, even though teachers kept asking who the other kid was. She described birthday parties where she insisted on 2 cakes because her brother should have been there, and how other kids thought she was making up an imaginary friend. Her voice got quiet when she explained how Mom never let her forget, never let her believe the lie that she was alone, and how that knowledge shaped everything about who she became. I told her about science fairs where I won first place and went home to silence, about making the robotics team and having nobody care, about spending 15 years wondering what was wrong with me that made my own parents treat me like furniture. She reached over and grabbed my hand, squeezing hard, and said she'd spent 15 years with half her heart missing, and now it was back. The preliminary hearing happened 6 weeks after I moved in with Claire, and I had to wear dress clothes that Grandpa bought because I'd never owned anything formal before. The courthouse smelled like floor polish and fear, and prosecutors laid out evidence on tables in front of the judge, while my adoptive parents sat at the defense table in orange jumpsuits. The prosecutor showed the forged adoption papers, the illegal surrogacy agreement with Claire's signature that handwriting experts proved was fake, and printouts of emails discussing my potential death. I sat in the witness box and answered questions about finding the documents, about what my life was like, about the Switzerland boarding school, and the trust money. My adoptive mother stared at me the entire time with this look that made my skin crawl, like I was the one who'd done something wrong, like I'd betrayed her by not dying conveniently. The defense attorney tried to make it sound like I'd misunderstood, like the emails were jokes, like they'd actually loved me, but the prosecutor showed more evidence, including research into having me declared mentally incompetent, so they could access the trust early. The judge's face got harder with each new piece of evidence, and when the prosecutor finished, she ordered my adoptive parents held without bail pending trial. I made it out of the courtroom before my legs stopped working, stumbling into the bathroom and collapsing on the tile floor. Everything I'd been holding together for weeks fell apart at once, and I couldn't breathe right, couldn't stop shaking, couldn't make sense of how 2 people could fake loving a child for 15 years while planning to kill him for money. Priscilla found me there 10 minutes later, sitting on the gross courthouse bathroom floor with my back against the wall. She didn't say anything about how I should feel or try to make it better with empty words. She just sat down next to me on that disgusting floor in her nice dress and stayed there until I could breathe normally again. When I finally stopped shaking, she said, "Blood doesn't make someone family. Love does, and those people never deserved me even for a second." She said our adoptive parents were broken inside in ways that had nothing to do with me, and I needed to remember I survived 15 years of emotional abuse and still turned out to be someone worth knowing. Grandpa showed up at Claire's apartment 2 days later with his lawyer and a stack of documents. He'd officially changed the trust to split everything equally between me and Priscilla, removing the male heir requirement that had motivated my kidnapping in the first place. He looked uncomfortable sitting on Claire's worn couch in his expensive suit, but he came back the next Sunday with groceries and did it again the Sunday after that. He was terrible at emotions and never said much, but he showed up every week and started paying for a bigger apartment so I could have my own actual bedroom instead of sleeping on a futon in the living room. Claire cried when he handed her the lease to a 3-bedroom place in a better neighborhood, and Grandpa looked away and cleared his throat and said something about how his grandson deserved a proper room. Moving into the new apartment felt like starting over completely. Claire let me and Priscilla design our own rooms however we wanted, and I filled mine with robotics equipment that Grandpa bought, science posters, and a real desk for my projects. Priscilla hung a photo on the wall between our rooms, the only picture that existed of us as babies together, taken by Claire in the hospital before my adoptive parents stole me. Looking at that photo felt strange because I could see both of us as infants, completely identical, with no idea that we'd spend the next 15 years apart. Priscilla wrote a caption under it that said, "Together again," and every time I walked past it, I felt something settle in my chest that had been wrong my entire life. Theodore called 3 weeks after the preliminary hearing to explain that the trial date was set for 4 months away. He said I'd probably have to testify again in the actual trial, and the prosecutor was confident about conviction given how strong the evidence was. But he warned me that defense attorneys would try to make me look like an ungrateful kid who misunderstood his parents' intentions, who made up stories because I was angry about normal parenting. I told Theodore I wasn't worried because the truth was, in those emails, in the forged documents, in 15 years of treating me like an obligation instead of a son. He said that was the right attitude, but to prepare myself anyway because trials got ugly. Claire took family leave from the hospital to be home more while I adjusted to everything, and she started teaching me and Priscilla to cook her mother's recipes. We burned chicken twice and set off the smoke alarm 3 times, and once we laughed so hard about a cooking disaster that we couldn't stop and had to order pizza instead. I realized this was what family was supposed to feel like, warm and safe and full of people who actually wanted you around, who laughed when things went wrong instead of going silent and cold. Claire told stories about her mother while we cooked, about growing up in a house that always smelled like garlic and tomatoes, about learning to make pasta from scratch when she was 8. She said she'd always imagined teaching these recipes to her kids someday, and now she finally got to do it. I joined the robotics club at my new school and discovered I was way ahead of most students because I'd been doing this since I was 8 years old. The teacher watched me work for 2 days and then asked if I'd be willing to help mentor younger students who were just starting out. Having a role where I was valued for my skills instead of tolerated as an obligation helped rebuild something inside me that had been damaged by 15 years of indifference. Kids actually listened when I explained concepts, actually seemed excited to learn from me, and the teacher praised my patience and teaching ability in front of the whole club. Detective Huang called on a Tuesday night while we were eating dinner, and Claire put her on speaker so we could all hear. She'd found more evidence during the investigation, documents showing my adoptive parents had researched other ways to access the trust early, including trying to have me declared mentally incompetent through fabricated psychological evaluations. They'd contacted 3 different doctors about diagnosing me with conditions I didn't have, looking for someone willing to sign papers that would let them control the trust before I turned 18. The prosecutor was adding attempted fraud charges to the existing counts, and their lawyers were pushing harder for a plea deal to avoid a long trial where all this evidence would become public record. Theodore called 2 weeks later with news about the prosecution's offer. They wanted both my adoptive parents to plead guilty to kidnapping, fraud, and child endangerment, and in exchange, they'd each get 15 years in prison instead of risking a trial that could mean 30 years or more. Claire sat next to me on the couch, while Theodore explained the details over speakerphone, and Priscilla stood in the doorway with her arms crossed. The deal meant my adoptive parents would have to admit everything they did in open court, read statements confessing to the illegal adoption and their plan to put me in danger for money. Theodore asked what I thought, and I looked at Claire, who squeezed my hand. I told him I wanted them to say out loud what they did, to admit they stole me and planned to hurt me. So yes, we'd accept the plea. Claire nodded and told Theodore to move forward with the agreement, and he said the plea hearing would happen within 3 weeks. The courthouse felt too bright and too cold on the morning of the hearing. Claire drove us there early, and we sat on a bench outside the courtroom waiting for Theodore. Priscilla kept checking her phone, and then putting it away, then checking it again, nervous energy making her fidget. When Theodore arrived, he walked us through what would happen, explaining that the judge would ask my adoptive parents to confirm they understood the charges and were pleading guilty voluntarily. They'd read their prepared statements admitting everything, and then the judge would ask if I wanted to make a victim statement before sentencing. I said yes, I wanted to speak, and Theodore nodded like he'd expected that answer. Inside the courtroom, my adoptive parents sat at the defense table wearing orange jumpsuits, their lawyers on either side. Neither of them turned around when we walked in. The judge entered and everyone stood, and then the proceedings started with the clerk reading the charges. Kidnapping of a minor, fraud, child endangerment, conspiracy. The words sounded heavy and official, nothing like the cold efficiency of my childhood or the emails planning my convenient death. The judge asked my adoptive mother if she understood the charges and if she was pleading guilty, and she said yes in a flat voice. Same questions for my adoptive father, same flat yes. Then came the statements. My adoptive mother went first, reading from a paper her lawyer had prepared. She admitted to taking me from Claire without legal authority, to forging adoption documents, to keeping my twin sister's existence hidden. She admitted to planning to send me to a boarding school where accidents happened frequently, knowing the danger and accepting it because of the financial benefit. Her voice never wavered, never broke, just read the words like she was reading a grocery list. When she finished, she sat down without looking at anyone. My adoptive father's statement was shorter but equally cold, admitting his role in everything and his knowledge of the scheme from the beginning. He said he knew the surrogacy was illegal, and he helped hide the evidence. He said he researched dangerous schools and approved the plan to send me there. Then he sat down too. The judge looked at me and asked if I wanted to make a statement before sentencing. I stood up, and my legs felt shaky, but I walked to the front of the courtroom anyway. I didn't have anything written down, so I just started talking. I told them they stole 15 years from me, from Claire, from Priscilla. I said they took away my chance to grow up with my real family, with a mother who actually loved me and a sister I didn't even know existed. I told them they made me feel worthless my entire childhood, like I was just an obligation they had to tolerate, and now I knew why. Because I was never their son, just a financial asset they were waiting to cash in. I said I hoped they spent every single day in prison thinking about what they lost by choosing money over love, thinking about how they could have just been decent people and let Claire keep her son. My voice cracked on the last part, but I kept going. I said they didn't deserve forgiveness, and I wasn't offering it, and I hoped 15 years felt as long for them as 15 years of emotional neglect felt for me. The judge thanked me, and I sat back down between Claire and Priscilla. Claire was crying silently, and Priscilla grabbed my hand and held it tight. The judge sentenced them each to 15 years in state prison with no possibility of parole for at least 10, and then it was over. The bailiff led my adoptive parents out through a side door, and they never looked back, never looked at me once during the entire hearing. Theodore gathered his papers and told us we were done, the case was closed, and they'd be transferred to prison within a week. Outside the courthouse, Claire pulled me and Priscilla into a hug and said this chapter was finished, and now we got to focus on being a family. She suggested ice cream, even though it was barely 11 in the morning, and we walked 3 blocks to a shop near the courthouse. Priscilla ordered mint chocolate chip without asking what I was getting, and when I ordered the same thing, we both started laughing. Claire smiled and ordered strawberry for herself, and we sat at a small table by the window eating ice cream and not talking about the hearing. Priscilla said of course we liked the same flavor. We were twins, and probably liked all the same things. I asked what else she liked, and she started listing things, robotics and science fiction and terrible action movies and staying up too late. I liked all of it too. 2 days after the hearing, Grandpa Whitmore called and asked me to come to his lawyer's office. When I got there, he had papers spread across the conference table and explained he was setting up separate education trusts for me and Priscilla, money that couldn't be touched except for college expenses. He said he wanted to make sure we could go to any school we wanted without worrying about cost, and the trusts would cover tuition, housing, books, everything. Then he asked his lawyer to leave the room and told me to sit down. He said he saw himself in me, the same stubborn independence and strategic thinking, the same refusal to accept unfair situations. He said he was proud of how I handled everything, from finding the evidence to confronting my adoptive parents to testifying in court. Most kids would have fallen apart, but I stayed strong and protected myself, and that took courage most adults didn't have. His voice got rough on the last part, and he cleared his throat and looked away, and I realized he was trying not to cry. The next week, I was walking home from the school with Claire and Priscilla when I called Claire Mom without thinking about it. I was telling a story about robotics club and said something about how Mom would like the project we were building, and the word just came out naturally. Claire stopped walking right there on the sidewalk and turned around and hugged me so tight I could barely breathe. Priscilla pulled out her phone and took a picture of us, and when Claire finally let go, Priscilla showed me the photo. She said she'd been waiting 15 years to see her mom hug her twin brother, and now she finally had proof it happened. I looked at the picture and saw Claire's face pressed against my shoulder, her eyes closed and my arms wrapped around her back, and something in my chest felt complete. School ended in June, and I'd made actual friends by then. People who liked me because I was interesting and funny, not because they were obligated to tolerate me. Priscilla's friends had become my friends too, and we all hung out together at lunch and after school. When summer started, we all signed up for robotics camp together, a 3-week intensive program at the community college. The camp was harder than I expected, but in a good way, with projects that actually challenged me and teachers who treated us like we were capable of real engineering work. On the last day, they held a competition for the advanced division, and I entered with a robot I'd been building the entire 3 weeks. Mom and Priscilla sat in the audience during the competition finals, and every time my robot completed a task, I could hear them cheering. They were so loud, the camp director had to ask them to keep it down, but they just cheered quieter, not silent. When the judges announced I'd won first place, Priscilla jumped up and screamed, and Mom started crying proud tears. She told everyone sitting near her that I was her son, pointing at me and wiping her eyes and smiling so wide it looked like her face might break. After the award ceremony, she hugged me and said she was so proud, and I realized this was what I'd been missing for 15 years. Someone who was genuinely happy about my success, who cried because they were proud instead of not even looking up from their laptop. A week later, Grandpa Whitmore called another family meeting and said he wanted to pay for family therapy. He explained that we all went through something difficult and needed help processing it together, and even though he wasn't comfortable with emotions, he'd show up every week if we agreed to go. Claire said yes immediately, and Priscilla and I agreed too. Our first session was awkward with everyone sitting stiff in chairs and not knowing what to say. But the therapist was patient and helped us talk about the kidnapping, the lost years, the guilt Claire felt for not finding me sooner. She explained that we were all hurt by my adoptive parents' choices, that their greed damaged everyone, and healing meant building new memories to replace the 15 years that got stolen. Our 16th birthday came in August, and Mom threw us a huge party at the apartment. She invited both our friend groups and made a massive cake with both our names on it. Priscilla gave me a photo album she'd been working on for weeks, filled with pictures from the past 6 months. There were photos of us at robotics camp, eating ice cream after the plea hearing, moving into the new apartment, cooking dinner with Mom. The last page had the baby photo of us together in the hospital, the one Claire took before I got stolen. And Priscilla had written a caption underneath that said, "Finally complete again." I hugged her and told her it was the best present anyone ever gave me. The next week, I got my driver's license and Mom let me drive her car home from the DMV. She sat in the passenger seat looking nervous but trying to hide it, and she didn't grab the handle once, even when I took a turn too fast. That weekend, Priscilla and I practiced parallel parking in an empty lot, taking turns behind the wheel and coaching each other. She told me she used to imagine teaching her twin brother to drive someday, back when she didn't know if she'd ever find me. She said she pictured us doing normal sibling things like this, arguing over who was the better driver and laughing when one of us hit a cone. Now we were actually doing it, actually living the life she'd imagined, and it felt right. A few weeks after my testimony, Detective Huang called and asked me to meet her at the police station one last time. Mom drove me there and waited in the lobby while I went back to Huang's office. She closed the door and told me the case was officially closed, that all the evidence had been processed and filed away. Then she looked at me and said, most kids wouldn't have had the courage to turn in their own parents, that what I did probably saved my life. She explained that the boarding school research showed clear intent, that they were planning something and my actions stopped it before anything could happen. I thanked her and shook her hand, and when I walked out to the lobby, Mom asked if I was okay, and I told her, yeah, I really was. Junior year started in September, and the robotics club held elections during the first meeting. I ran for vice president because I figured I had a decent chance after winning competitions last year. Priscilla ran for president, and we both gave speeches about our goals for the team. When the votes came in, we'd both won, which meant we'd be running the club together. Our teacher made a joke about having twins lead the team being either the best idea or the worst, and we promised to prove it was the best. That semester, we entered 3 competitions and won all 3, with Priscilla handling the strategy and me focusing on the technical builds. Our teammates started calling us the dynamic duo, and it felt good to be part of something where people actually wanted me around. In October, Mom came home from the hospital looking nervous and asked if she could talk to me and Priscilla together. We sat on the couch, and she told us she'd been seeing someone, a doctor from her floor named Joshua. She said it wasn't serious yet, but it was getting more serious, and she wanted to know if we'd be okay with him coming to dinner sometime. I looked at Priscilla, and she looked at me, and we both told Mom the same thing, that she deserved to be happy. Mom's eyes got watery, and she hugged us both, and 2 weeks later, Joshua came over for spaghetti. He was nice and asked us about robotics and school, and he didn't try too hard to impress us, which made him more likable. After dinner, I saw Mom laughing at something he said, and she looked lighter than I'd seen her in months, and it felt right watching her with someone who actually appreciated her. Right before Thanksgiving, Grandpa Whitmore called Mom in the middle of the night, and she rushed to the hospital. He'd had chest pains and thought it was a heart attack, but it turned out to be a minor issue with his medication. Still, it scared all of us enough that we realized how precious time actually was. When he got released, Grandpa suggested we start having Sunday dinners every week without fail, and we all agreed immediately. Every Sunday, we'd go to his house and he'd have food delivered, and after we ate, he started teaching me and Priscilla about money. He showed us investment portfolios and explained compound interest, preparing us for the trust we'd inherit when we turned 18. He treated us like capable adults whose opinions mattered, asking what we thought about different financial strategies and listening when we answered. In January, I applied to a summer robotics program at MIT that only accepted 30 students nationwide. The application required essays and project portfolios, and I spent weeks putting together my best work. When the acceptance letter came in March, Mom literally screamed and then started crying. She framed the letter and hung it in the living room next to a photo of me and Priscilla. A week later, Priscilla got her acceptance letter too, and we realized we'd be spending the summer together at MIT, doing what we loved most. Mom took us out for celebration dinner and told everyone at the restaurant that both her kids got into MIT's program, embarrassing us, but also making us feel proud. The MIT program started in June and was even better than I expected. The professors gave us real engineering challenges, not the simplified versions we usually got in high school programs. One of the professors pulled me aside after the first week and asked if I'd considered applying to MIT for college. I told him I hadn't really thought that far ahead, and he said I should. The next day, the same professor talked to Priscilla. At lunch, we compared notes and realized we'd both been thinking the same thing without saying it out loud. We decided right there to apply early decision as a package deal, both of us or neither of us. The professor overheard us and smiled, saying MIT loved sibling applicants who pushed each other to be better. Senior year hit like a freight train with college applications due by November. Mom helped us write our essays about overcoming adversity, but she made sure we didn't just relive trauma on paper. She told us we weren't defined by what got stolen from us, but by who we chose to become after getting it back. We wrote about finding family, about resilience, about using robotics as a way to build something good from something broken. Our guidance counselor read our essays and got teary, saying they were some of the most powerful she'd ever seen. We submitted our applications on the same day in early November, and then waited. The acceptance letters came in mid-December on the same day, both thick envelopes with the MIT logo. Priscilla opened hers first and screamed. Then I opened mine, and we were both jumping around the apartment like maniacs. Mom started crying happy tears and called Grandpa Whitmore, who came over within an hour. He pretended he wasn't emotional, but his voice kept cracking when he congratulated us, and he kept wiping his eyes and blaming it on allergies, even though it was winter. We'd both gotten full scholarships plus money from our education trusts, which meant we could go without any financial stress. Priscilla framed both acceptance letters side by side and hung them in our hallway. Graduation came in June, and I'd been chosen to give a speech as salutatorian. I wrote it about finding your real family, about how DNA matters less than who shows up for you when things get hard. Standing at the podium, I looked out at the audience and saw Mom, Priscilla, and Grandpa Whitmore in the front row. They were cheering before I even started talking, and Mom had tissues ready because she knew she'd cry. I gave my speech, and people actually listened instead of being bored like they usually are at graduation. Afterward, Mom hugged me so tight I could barely breathe and told me she was so proud of the person I'd become despite everything. I told her I was proud too, and I meant it. We spent the summer before college making memories as a family, taking a road trip to see national parks out west. We stayed up late in hotel rooms talking about everything and nothing, playing card games and laughing until our stomachs hurt. Grandpa Whitmore came on part of the trip and complained about his back, but smiled the whole time. One night in Yellowstone, I looked through photos on my phone and found ones from 2 years ago when I was alone and unloved in that cold house. Then I looked at recent photos of me surrounded by people who chose to fight for me, who celebrated my wins and supported me through hard things. I showed Priscilla, and she said that sometimes the worst thing that happens to you leads you exactly where you're supposed to be. And looking at Mom sleeping in the next bed and thinking about Grandpa Whitmore in the room next door, I knew she was right.